Chapter 1. The Trail of Dust and Silence. The groan of the wagon wheels ground to a halt, a final, weary sound in the vast, stretching silence of the prairie. Little Jane pressed her face against the rough canvas, the scratchy fibers imprinting a pattern on her cheek. She watched her stepmother, Agnes, climb down, her movements stiff and deliberate. There was a coldness in Agnes's eyes that seemed to mirror the endless, indifferent blue of the sky. "This is where you get off, girl," Agnes said. Her voice was flat, a stone skipping across the surface of a pond, leaving no ripple. She didn't look back. Jane, all of 8 years old, clutched her worn rag doll, Willow, as the wagon lurched forward again. It rolled away, carving a path through the dust, leaving her utterly alone on the amber trail with nothing but the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. She couldn't know, that perched on a ridge high above, a man named Silas Thorne was watching through a spyglass, a man whose life was about to intersect with hers in a way that would change the very fabric of their futures. The autumn wind was a sharp, invisible blade, slicing through the thin fabric of Jane's dress. She stood in the heart of the trail, a tiny, solitary figure, as the dust cloud from her stepmother's wagon shrank, wavered, and finally dissolved into the horizon. Her bare feet, already tender, flinched against the rocky ground. The sun, a great, bleeding orb of orange, was sinking low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the land. "Mama," she whispered to Willow, pressing the doll's faded face to her own. Willow was the last piece of her real mother, a woman lost to fever 2 winters ago. "What do we do now?" Jane had always known Agnes resented her presence. After her papa died in a mining collapse the previous spring, the resentment had hardened into something sharp and cruel. "You're not even my blood," Agnes had spat more times than Jane could count. "Your papa left me with nothing but his debts and another mouth to feed." The little girl's gaze swept across the empty prairie. It was a terrifying expanse of muted greens and browns. The grown-ups' hushed stories of wolves, bears, and hostile tribes echoed in her memory. A hollow ache bloomed in her stomach, a gnawing hunger that had been her constant companion for days. She had no blanket against the coming night, no shoes for her aching feet. But living with Agnes had forged a surprising resilience in her small frame. She was tougher than she looked. Jane picked a direction, one that felt less empty than the others, and began to walk, holding Willow so tightly her knuckles were white. Chapter 2. The Man on the Ridge. Up on the ridge, Silas Thorne lowered his spyglass. He'd been tracking a herd of wild mustangs, their fluid movement a balm to his restless soul, when the solitary wagon had caught his eye. Something about the way the woman had unloaded the child, as if discarding unwanted baggage, and driven off without a single backward glance, made his jaw clench until it ached. Silas was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands weathered by work and rains, and kind brown eyes that held a deep, lingering sorrow. At 35, he was the proprietor of the Serenity Ridge Ranch, the largest in the Caldera Territory, with more cattle than he could count and a grand house that echoed with a profound loneliness. People called him the wealthiest man in 3 counties, but all the gold in his coffers couldn't fill the cavernous, empty rooms of his heart. He'd been married once, to a gentle soul named Eleanor. They had dreamt of filling the big house with the sound of children's laughter. But Eleanor had been stolen by a fever during childbirth, taking their infant son with her into the silent dark. That was a decade ago, a decade of silence. Now, he watched this small girl journeying across the prairie as if she owned it, her head held high in a gesture of defiant courage. Something in her posture, in that stubborn spirit, reminded him so fiercely of Eleanor that it stole his breath. In that moment, watching the small, determined figure, Silas Thorne made a decision. He spurred his horse, a powerful bay, down the rocky slope. Jane heard the rhythmic beat of hooves on the hard-packed earth before she saw the rider. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs, ready to bolt like a frightened rabbit. But as the man and horse drew closer, she saw something in his bearing that was different from the rough, loud men who had sometimes visited Agnes. Silas pulled his horse to a gentle stop a few feet away and tipped his hat, a gesture of respect that startled her. "Afternoon, miss," he said, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "You seem to be a long way from anywhere." Jane lifted her chin, a flicker of pride in her tired eyes. "I'm going to find a new home," she announced, though she had no idea where that might be. "A new home is a far piece from here," Silas said, fighting the urge to smile at her gravity. "Mind if I ask where your folks are?" "Don't have any folks," Jane said, with the simple finality of a child who has accepted a harsh truth. "My mama died, my papa died, and my stepmother left me here." A hot, sharp anger coiled in Silas's gut. He forced the muscles in his jaw to relax, smoothed the hard line of his mouth, and kept his voice calm. "Left you here on purpose?" "She said she couldn't feed me anymore, said I wasn't her problem." Jane's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. The words landed like punches. Silas dismounted, the leather of his saddle creaking in the quiet. He knelt in the dust, bringing himself to her level. "What's your name, little lady?" "Jane Vance, and this is Willow." She held up the rag doll for inspection. "Well, Miss Jane Vance, I'm Silas Thorne. I own a ranch not too far from here. I was wondering if you and Willow might like to come have some supper with me. My cook makes the best beef stew in the whole Caldera territory." Jane studied his face, her gaze serious and searching. Agnes had filled her head with warnings about strangers, but this man's eyes didn't hold any of the meanness she was used to. And she was so hungry, the pain in her stomach was a constant twisting knot. "I don't have any money to pay for supper," she said, her voice small. "Well, that's lucky," Silas said, a genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "You have a policy about little girls?" "I do indeed," he said solemnly. "Rule number 1, little girls eat for free. Rule number 2, little girls should never be left on dusty trails all by themselves. Rule number 3, little girls should always have a warm, safe place to sleep." Jane looked around, at the vast, darkening prairie, then back at Silas's ice. "Are you a good man, Mr. Thorne?" The question, so direct and innocent, struck him right in the heart. "I try to be, Miss Jane. I try real hard." She nodded slowly, as if weighing a great decision. "Willow says it's okay to trust you." Silas looked at the worn doll with mock seriously. "Well, if Willow says so, then that settles it." He stood up, the dust puffing around his boots, and held out his large, calloused hand. "Shall we go get that stew?" Jane placed her small, dirt-smudged hand in his. As his fingers closed around hers, Silas felt something shift deep inside his chest. A place that had been frozen solid for 10 long years began, ever so slightly, to thaw. Chapter 3. Serenity Ridge. The Serenity Ridge Ranch spread across the valley like a small, self-contained town. Jane, perched in front of Silas on his horse, had never imagined such a place existed. There were sprawling barns and corrals full of horses, a long bunkhouse for the cowboys, and a cookhouse from which the most delicious smells she had ever encountered were drifting on the evening air. But it was the main house that made her gasp aloud. It was a fortress of log and stone, larger than any building she had ever seen, with a wide porch that wrapped around the entire front. Golden light glowed from the windows, beacons of warmth and welcome against the encroaching twilight. "You live in there all by yourself?" Jane asked, her voice filled with awe as Silas helped her down. "Just me and Sophia, my housekeeper," Silas said, his voice holding a hint of the emptiness she had just remarked upon. As if summoned, a woman appeared on the porch. She was plump, with graying hair braided down her back, and the kindest face Jane had ever seen. "Dios mío!" Sophia exclaimed when she saw Jane, her hands flying to her cheeks. "Silas, what have you brought home now?" "Sophia, this is Miss Jane Vance," Silas said. "She's going to be our guest for supper."
Sophia hurried down the porch steps and knelt before Jane, her warm eyes taking in the thin dress, the bare, dusty feet, and the tangled, windswept hair. "Ay, pobrecita," she murmured, her voice like a soft blanket. "You look as if you haven't had a proper meal in days." "Just since yesterday," Jane clarified, "and I had half a biscuit then." A flash of fire lit Sophia's eyes, but her voice remained gentle. "Well, we will fix that right up. Come, Nina, let's get you cleaned up and fed." Silas watched as Sophia led Jane into the house, her voice a comforting stream of mixed English and Spanish. The little girl looked impossibly small framed in the grand doorway. Later that evening, after Jane had devoured 2 bowls of the promised stew and fallen fast asleep on the sofa by the crackling fireplace, Sophia found Silas staring into the flames. "She is staying, isn't she?" Sophia asked softly. Silas looked at the sleeping child, one small hand still clutching her doll. He couldn't imagine sending her away, to the grim orphanage in Stone Creek or anywhere else. "I can't just send her away, Sophia. She's been through enough." "More than enough," Sophia agreed, her gaze falling on Jane's hands. "Look at those hands, rough. She has been working hard for someone so small." Silas had noticed them too. They were chapped and calloused, with the faint silvery lines of old scars, kitchen burns, he suspected. What kind of woman would work an 8-year-old child so hard, only to abandon her on a desolate trail? "I'll ride into town tomorrow," Silas said, his voice firm with resolve. "Talk to Magistrate Pierce, see what needs to be done, legal-like." Sophia's knowing smile was gentle. So she is staying. Silas looked at Jane again, at the way she held her doll protectively even in sleep. "Yeah," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "She's staying." Chapter 4. A New Beginning. Jane awoke in the softest bed she had ever felt, cocooned in a warmth that was entirely new to her. For a dizzying moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then she saw Sophia setting a pitcher of warm water on the washstand, a gentle smile on her face. "Buenos dias, Niña," she said. "Did you sleep well?" Jane sat up, her eyes wide as she took in the room. It had real glass windows with lace curtains, a colorful quilt on the bed, and a thick, soft rug on the floor. "Is this really for me?" "See, this is your room now," Sophia said. "Silas, he says you are to stay here as long as you want." "Really?" Jane couldn't believe it. "But I can't pay for anything." "Nina, listen to me." Sophia's voice was earnest. "Silas Thorne, he is a good man. His heart was broken a long time ago, and it never healed right. But yesterday, when he brought you home, I saw something in his eyes I have not seen in 10 years. "What did you see?" Jane whispered. "Hope," Sophia said simply. "Now come, let's get you dressed. I have something for you." The something was a beautiful blue dress with petticoats that rustled when she moved. It was a little too big, but Sophia promised to alter it. There were also real leather shoes, the first Jane had ever owned that hadn't been worn-out hand-me-downs. "Where did these come from?" Jane asked, her hands stroking the soft cotton fabric of the dress. Sophia's eyes grew sad for a moment. They belonged to someone who doesn't need them anymore, someone who would be very happy to know a little girl was finally wearing them. Jane would learn later that the clothes had been Eleanor's, kept by Silas in a cedar chest for a decade, unable to part with them until now. When Jane came downstairs, her hair brushed and tied with a ribbon, Silas was waiting in the kitchen. A plate of hot cakes and sizzling bacon sat at her place at the big wooden table. "Well, don't you look fine?" he said, his voice sounding a little rough around the edges. "Sophia says I can stay here," Jane said, climbing onto a chair that was almost too tall for her. Silas sat across from her. "I'm sure you are," he said gently, "but a little girl should be spending her time learning how to read and write, not scrubbing floors." Jane's eyes lit up. You would teach me to read? She had always wanted to learn, but Agnes said it was a waste of time. Reading, writing, and arithmetic, Silas promised, and anything else you want to learn. How to ride a horse? She whispered, barely daring to hope. How to be a proper young lady, he said, a warm smile spreading across his face. He reached across the table and patted her small hand. If you want to learn it, then that's what we'll do. The following weeks passed like a wonderful dream. Every morning, Silas would spend an hour with her in his study, a room that smelled of leather and old paper, teaching her letters and numbers. Her mind, sharp and eager, soaked up knowledge like a dry sponge. Soon, she was piecing together words, then whole sentences. In the afternoons, Silas taught her to ride on a gentle old mare named Dandelion. At first, Jane was terrified of being so high off the ground, but Silas walked beside her, his hand steady on the reins, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor. Sophia taught her other things, how to knead bread, how to sew a straight seam, how to run a household with kindness instead of anger. She told stories while they worked and sang beautiful, sad songs in Spanish that made Jane feel a strange mix of joy and melancholy. In my village, Sophia said one day as they shaped tortillas, my abuela used to say that God puts people in our path exactly when we need them most. Silas, he needed you, Niña, and you needed him. But I'm nobody special, Jane said, patting her tortilla just as Sophia had shown her. Ah, Niña, you are very special. You have a brave heart and a strong spirit. Silas sees this. That is why he wants you to stay, forever. Forever? The word echoed in Jane's heart. She had never had a forever before. That evening, as Silas was reading her a story by the fire, Jane looked up at his strong, kind face, illuminated by the flames. Silas? Yes, sweetheart. Her voice was barely a whisper. Could I call you Papa? Silas's hand stilled on the page. For a long, silent moment, he couldn't speak. When he finally looked down at her, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'd be honored, Jane, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Jane smiled and snuggled closer, her head finding the perfect spot on his shoulder. Good night, Papa. Good night, little one, he whispered back, his heart feeling fuller than it had in a decade. Sweet dreams. Chapter 5. The Shadow of the Past. Life at Serenity Ridge wasn't always a sun-drenched dream. The nightmares came sometimes, vivid and terrifying, leaving Jane crying out in the dark, the feeling of the dusty trail still clinging to her. On those nights, Silas would come to her room, his big frame filling the doorway, and sit with her until the fear receded and she drifted back to sleep, lulled by his deep, steady presence. There were other challenges. A few of the ranch hands grumbled about the boss suddenly having a daughter. She's got him wrapped around her little finger, Jane overheard Grumbles, the camp cook, say to another man. Mark my words, she'll be trouble. But most of the cowboys were kind. Old Jasper carved her a perfect wooden horse. Young Finn taught her how to whistle, loud enough to call the dogs. And Clay, the foreman, always tipped his hat to her as if she were a grown-up lady. One crisp autumn day, 2 months after her arrival, a stranger rode up to the ranch. He was a thin, severe man in a black suit who introduced himself as Mr. Finch, a representative of the Territorial Children's Welfare Bureau. I've heard reports of an unaccompanied minor residing at this ranch, he said to Silas. A ranch is no place for a young girl. She belongs in a proper institution. Jane, hiding just inside the kitchen door, felt a cold dread freeze her heart. They were going to take her away. This little girl has a home here, Silas said, his voice as hard and unyielding as granite. She has been legally adopted. I have the papers from Magistrate Pierce. Be that as it may, Mr. Finch sniffed, a single man raising a child alone is highly irregular. The Bureau feels she would be better served in one of our facilities." "Your facilities?" Silas's voice dropped to a dangerously quiet level. "You mean that orphanage in Stone Creek where the children work 14 hours a day and sleep 4 to a bed?" "We provide structure and discipline," Mr. Finch sniffed stiffly. "You provide misery," Silas shot back. "Now get off my land before I have you thrown off."
After the man had gone, his back rigid with indignation, Jane crept out of her hiding place. Silas was standing by the window, his hands clenched into tight fists. "Papa," she asked in a small voice, "are they going to take me away?" Silas turned and knelt, pulling her into a fierce, protective hug. "No, sweetheart, nobody is ever going to take you away from me. This is your home, and I'm your papa. That's the end of it. But what if they come back?" "Then we'll fight them," he said, his voice a raw promise. "Again and again, as many times as it takes. You are my daughter now, Jane Thorne. That's not something anyone can change." The fear drained out of her, replaced by a fierce, soaring joy. Thorne. She was Jane Thorne now, not Vance. She had a real name, a real family. As winter blanketed the valley in a pristine layer of white, Jane thrived. She could now read whole books by herself, write her name in perfect cursive, and ride her mare Dandelion without a lead rope. But more importantly, she was learning to trust, to believe that this new life was real, that Silas wouldn't change his mind, that Sophia would always be there with a hug, and that the nightmares would, eventually, fade into memory. One snowy December morning, Silas called her into his study. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small wrapped package from his desk drawer. Inside was a beautiful gold locket on a delicate chain. When she opened the clasp, she found a tiny painted photograph of a woman with Silas's kind eyes and dark wavy hair. "That's Eleanor," Silas said softly, "my wife. She would have loved you very much." "She's beautiful," Jane whispered, tracing the image with the tip of her finger. "She always wanted a daughter," Silas continued, his voice thick with memory. "Someone to teach and love and watch grow up. I think maybe she sent you to me." He fastened the locket around Jane's neck. "I want you to have it, not to replace your real mama, but because you are part of our family now. Eleanor would want you to have it." Jane hugged him tightly, the cool metal of the locket pressing against her chest. "Thank you, Papa. I'll take good care of it." "I know you will, sweetheart," he murmured into her hair. "I know you will." That night, Jane looked at her reflection in the mirror. The scared, hungry little girl from the amber trail was gone. In her place stood a young lady with bright eyes, a golden locket, and a future that stretched before her, full of possibilities. She touched the locket gently. "Thank you, Mama Eleanor," she whispered. "Thank you for sending me to Papa." Chapter 6. The Return of the Storm. Spring came early to the Caldera territory that year, melting the snow and turning the hills a vibrant, impossible green. Jane celebrated her 9th birthday with the biggest party Serenity Ridge had ever seen. Sophia baked a cake with 9 candles, and Silas gave her a spirited young mare of her own, which she named Starlight. Life was a perfect, sunlit dream, which was why, perhaps, she should have known it couldn't last. Agnes Patterson returned on a blistering hot day in July, driving the very same wagon she had used to abandon Jane nearly a year before. But she was not alone. A heavy-set man with cruel, narrow eyes sat beside her, and 2 rough-looking men on horseback trailed behind them like vultures. Jane was in the garden with Sophia, tending to the tomato plants, when the wagon rattled into the yard. At the sight of her stepmother, all the color drained from her face. "Dios mío," Sophia breathed, instinctively pulling Jane behind her skirts. Silas emerged from the barn, his expression hardening into a thunderous mask when he saw his visitors.
"Agnes," he said, his voice as cold as a winter river. "You have some nerve showing your face here." Agnes climbed down from the wagon, attempting a look of dignity in her worn dress. "I've come for my stepdaughter," she announced, her voice loud enough for the gathering ranch hands to hear. "Your stepdaughter?" Silas's laugh was a harsh, humorless bark. "The one you dumped on the trail like a bag of garbage?" I was going through hard times," Agnes stammered, her eyes shifting away from his piercing gaze. "But things are better now. Gideon here is my new husband. We can provide for Jane properly." The heavy-set man, Gideon Crow, stepped forward, his bulk casting a menacing shadow. "The name's Gideon Crow," he said, "and I aim to collect what's mine." "Jane isn't yours," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She is my legally adopted daughter." "Well, see, that's where you're wrong," Crow said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "This here says different. Says I'm her legal guardian now, seeing as how I married her stepmother." Silas took the paper and read it, his jaw tightening with every line. "This is a fraud." "Signed by a judge in the Crimson Territory," Crow countered. "All legal and proper." Behind Sophia, Jane was trembling. She remembered Gideon Crow now. He was one of the men who used to visit Agnes, a man whose gaze had always made her skin crawl. "I'm not going with you," she said, stepping out from behind Sophia. Her voice was small, but it rang with determination. Agnes's face twisted into a familiar, ugly sneer. "You'll do as you're told, you ungrateful little brat. After all I did for you." "All you did?" Jane's fear was being consumed by a righteous anger. "You made me work like a slave. You burned me with the flat iron when I didn't work fast enough. You left me to die." "I never," Agnes protested, but a guilty flush crept up her neck. "The child has scars," Silas said, his voice deadly quiet. Crow just shrugged. "Kids get hurt. Part of growing up. Now we'll be taking her." "No," Jane said, more firmly this time. "I won't go. Silas is my papa now. This is my home." Crow's eyes narrowed. "Maybe you need a reminder of your place, girl." He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched. Silas moved faster than a striking snake. One moment, Crow was reaching for Jane. The next, he was flat on his back in the dust with Silas's boot pressed firmly on his chest. "Touch her," Silas said, his voice a simple statement of fact, "and you die." The two men on horseback reached for their guns, but froze as they found themselves facing 6 armed ranch hands who had materialized as if from the very earth. Clay had his rifle trained on the first man, while Jasper and Finn flanked the second. "I'd think real careful about your next move," Clay drawled. The standoff hung in the hot, still air for several long, tense moments. Finally, Crow struggled to his feet, brushing the dust from his clothes. "This ain't over," he snarled at Silas. "I've got legal papers. I'll be back with the sheriff." "You do that," Silas said calmly. "And when you do, make sure you bring a real judge to look at those fake papers of yours." After they had gone, leaving a trail of dust and threats behind them, Silas gathered a shaking Jane into his arms. "Are they going to take me away, Papa?" she whispered into his chest. "Not if I have anything to say about it," he said fiercely. But as he held her, a cold knot of worry tightened in his stomach. The paper might be a forgery, but it had looked official enough to fool a man who wasn't looking too closely. This storm was far from over. Chapter 7. A Marriage of the Heart. That evening, Silas called a meeting in the main house. Clay, Sophia, and several of the older, most trusted hands gathered around the large kitchen table, the air thick with tension. "What do we know about this Gideon Crow?" Silas asked, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he wasn't drinking. "Nothing good," Clay said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Word is he's got a reputation for taking in orphans and working them. Gets paid by folks who don't want to be bothered raising their own kin." Sophia's face went pale. "Dio santo, they sell children." Not exactly sell, Clay clarified grimly. More like rent them out. The kid works for their keep, and anything extra goes right into Crow's pocket. Silas's hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table. Over my dead body. Problem is, boss, old Jesper said slowly, if he's got papers that look official, he might be able to convince a territorial judge, especially if he claims you ain't fit to raise a girl. What do you mean? Silas asked, his gut twisting. Well, Jasper said, looking uncomfortable, you're a single man, living out here with a young girl. Some folks, they might get the wrong idea. Silas felt physically sick. The idea that anyone, anywhere, could imagine him harming Jane was a vile, unbearable thought. But he knew Jasper was right. There were people in the world who would always assume the worst. So, what do we do? Sophia asked, her voice trembling slightly.
Silas looked around the table at the faces of the people who had become his family. We fight, he said, but we do it by the book. I'm riding for Stone Creek tomorrow to see Magistrate Pierce. If anyone can help us, he can. The magistrate, a tall, dignified man with silver hair and shrewd eyes, examined the document Silas described. The papers are forgeries, he confirmed, but they're good ones. Someone went to a lot of trouble. Can you stop them? Silas asked. I can try, but Silas, you need to understand something. The law isn't always on the side of what's right. Some judges might look at your situation and decide that a young girl needs a woman's influence. Silas's heart sank. So they could take her, even with the fake papers? It's possible, the magistrate said, leaning forward, but I have an idea. What if you weren't a single man anymore? I don't understand. Marriage, Silas. If you were married to a respectable woman, no one could question your fitness to raise Jane. Silas's heart sank. So they could take her, even with the fake papers? It's possible, the magistrate said, leaning forward, but I have an idea. What if you weren't a single man anymore? I don't understand. Marriage, Silas. If you were married to a respectable woman, no one could question your fitness to raise Jane. Silas's heart sank. So they could take her, even with the fake papers? It's possible, the magistrate said, leaning forward, but I have an idea. What if you weren't a single man anymore? I don't understand. Marriage, Silas. If you were married to a respectable woman, no one could question your fitness to raise Jane. I can't just marry someone for convenience, Silas protested. That wouldn't be fair to anyone. Magistrate Pierce smiled slightly. I'm not talking about a marriage of convenience. I'm talking about Sophia Velasquez. Silas's mouth fell open. Sophia? Don't tell me you haven't noticed the way she looks at you, or the way you look at her. That woman has been in love with you for years, Silas, and you've been too blind with grief to see it. On the long ride home, the magistrate's words echoed in Silas's mind. He thought about Sophia, really thought about her, for the first time. He saw the way her face lit up when she smiled, heard the soft humming of her songs in the kitchen, felt the warmth she brought to every corner of his cold, empty house. He remembered the fierce, protective way she had shielded Jane from Crow, standing between them like a lioness. He realized with a sudden, breathtaking clarity that the magistrate was right. He had been blind. By the time he reached the gates of Serenity Ridge, Silas Thorne knew what he had to do. Crow returned 3 days later with the county sheriff in tow. Sheriff Davis was a decent man, but a stickler for the law. I'm sorry, Silas, he said, holding the fraudulent paper, but this looks official to me. I have to let them take the girl. Those papers are fake, Silas said firmly. Magistrate Pierce confirmed it. Maybe so, but I can't tell the difference. My hands are tied. Jane pressed close to Silas's side, her small hand gripping his. I won't go, she said quietly. This is my home.
Crow stepped forward, his ugly smile back in place. "Come on, girl, don't make this any harder than it has to be." A clear voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned. Sophia stood in the doorway of the house, dressed in her Sunday best, her chin held high. "There is something you all should know," she announced, her voice ringing with conviction. "Silas and I are getting married, today." A stunned silence fell over the yard. That's not possible," Agnes sputtered. "Actually, they can," Sheriff Davis said, looking immensely relieved. "If Mr. Thorne is married to a respectable woman, there's no question about his fitness to raise the child." Crow's face turned a blotchy purple. "This is a setup. They're just doing this to keep the girl." The sheriff looked directly at Silas. "Are you? Is this a sham marriage?" Silas turned and looked at Sophia, standing there so brave and beautiful, offering him everything. And in that moment, all the unspoken feelings of the past years crystallized into a single, undeniable truth. "No," he said, and his voice was strong and sure. "It's not a sham. I love her. I should have told her years ago." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but her smile radiant. "Well then," the sheriff said, tipping his hat, "I guess there's nothing more to discuss. Congratulations on your upcoming marriage." After Crow and Agnes had departed in a cloud of dust and curses, Silas took Sophia's hands in his. "Sophia," he said softly, his heart overflowing, "I need you to know, what I said back there wasn't just to save Jane. I meant every word." "I know," she whispered, her hands warm in his. "I have been waiting a very long time for you to figure it out." "Will you really marry me, Sophia? Not just for Jane, but because you want to be my wife?" She reached up and cupped his weathered cheek. "Sí, mi amor. I will marry you because I love you. I have loved you for a very long time." Jane threw her arms around both of them, her small body trembling with relief and joy. Does this mean Sophia will be my mama now?" "If you will have me," Sophia said, pulling her into their embrace. "Oh, yes," Jane breathed, her face buried in Sophia's dress. "I want that more than anything in the whole world." They were married that very afternoon by Magistrate Pierce, who had ridden out from Stone Creek as soon as he received Silas's telegram. The entire crew of Serenity Ridge gathered on the front porch to witness the ceremony. Sophia wore one of Eleanor's gowns, which Silas had offered and she had accepted with tears in her eyes. "She would want you to be happy," he had told her. Jane stood between them, holding a bouquet of wildflowers, her face beaming. As the magistrate pronounced them husband and wife, the cowboys whooped and fired their pistols into the air, a joyous salute to the new family forged in the heart of the valley. Chapter 8. The Fullness of Home. 5 years later, Jane Thorne stood on that same porch, no longer a small girl, but a confident young lady of 14. She could ride as well as any cowboy, read better than most adults, and help Sophia run the largest ranch in 3 counties. She still wore Eleanor's locket, which now fit her perfectly, and she still kept Willow on her bed, a treasured reminder of the little girl she once was. The Serenity Ridge Ranch had grown, not just in size, but in spirit. Silas and Sophia had built a small schoolhouse for the children of the ranch hands, with Jane serving as the teacher's assistant. And their family had grown too. Little Eleanor, named in honor of Silas's first wife, was a bright-eyed 3-year-old who followed Jane everywhere. Baby Leo was just learning to take his first wobbly steps. Sometimes, Jane would ride Starlight out to the spot on the Amber Trail where Agnes had left her. She would sit on her horse and look out across the vast prairie, remembering the scared, lonely child she had been. She never saw Agnes or Gideon Crow again. Word had reached the ranch that Crow had been arrested for fraud in the Crimson Territory, and Agnes had simply vanished. Jane rarely thought of them, and when she did, it was with a distant pity rather than anger. On this particular evening, as the setting sun painted the Caldera sky in breathtaking shades of gold and rose, Silas joined her on the ridge.
A penny for your thoughts, he said, his horse settling beside hers. Just thinking, Jane said, gaze fixed on the horizon. Thinking about how different things could have been. If you hadn't been tracking those Mustangs that day. If you hadn't seen me. Silas smiled, the same kind, steady smile that had won her trust all those years ago. But I did see you, and you know what I think? I think it was meant to be. I think Eleanor really did send you to us. We needed each other, Jane girl. We were all broken in our own ways, and together we became whole. Jane reached over and squeezed his hand. I love you, Papa. I love you too, sweetheart, more than all the cattle in the Caldera territory. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars begin to prick the darkening sky. In the valley below, the lights of the Serenity Ridge Ranch glowed, a warm and welcoming beacon. Papa, Jane said suddenly, do you think there are other children out there, lost and scared like I was? Silas studied her face in the twilight. Even at 14, she possessed the same deep well of compassion that had struck him when she was 8. I'm sure there are. I've been thinking, she said, her voice filled with a new purpose. Maybe we could help them, like you helped me. Maybe we could start a home, right here, for children who don't have anywhere else to go. A wave of immense pride washed over Silas, so powerful it almost brought tears to his eyes. This was his daughter, not by blood, by choice, by love, and she had grown into the exact kind of person he had always hoped she would be. That's a fine idea, Jane, he said, his voice thick with emotion. A very fine idea indeed. We'll talk to your mama about it when we get home.
As they turned their horses and rode back toward the welcoming lights of the ranch house, Jane felt a deep, profound sense of contentment settle over her. She had found her place, her purpose, her family. The scared little girl on the trail was a ghost of the past, replaced by a young woman ready to create a sanctuary for others. The windows of Serenity Ridge glowed like beacons of hope. And somewhere inside, Sophia was probably already planning how they could turn the big, once empty house into a home for even more lost children. After all, that's what the Thorne family did best. They took broken things and made them whole again. They took lost souls and gave them a place to belong.